In 1974, nearly 30 years after World War II officially ended, a Japanese soldier stepped out of the jungle on a small Pacific island, rifle in hand, uniform still pressed by habit, instincts still sharp. He wasn't reenacting history. He wasn't confused for a moment. He believed with absolute certainty that the war was still going on. To the rest of the world, this made no sense. By then, cities had been rebuilt, new nations had formed, and an entirely new generation had grown up knowing World War II only through textbooks and memorials. But on this island, time had stalled. The war hadn't ended in 1945, it had simply faded out of reach. This is the story of how that happened, and why it took decades to undo. The island itself was remote, dense, and unforgiving. Thick jungle swallowed sound, light, and movement. From the air, it looked untouched. From the ground, it was a maze of vines, caves, and shadows, the perfect place to disappear. During the final years of World War II, the Japanese military had scattered small units across such islands throughout the Pacific, tasked with slowing Allied advances and gathering intelligence for as long as possible. When defeat became inevitable, many of these units were never formally extracted. Some received their last orders in fragments, others received none at all. And on this island, the final instruction was devastatingly simple: do not surrender. At first, the soldiers waited for reinforcements. They expected ships, planes, signals. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Then something stranger happened. The fighting stopped. No more bombing, no more enemy patrols pushing inland. Silence settled over the jungle. But silence did not mean peace. To these men, silence meant strategy. It meant the enemy was regrouping. It meant traps, deception, psychological warfare. And when the first leaflets appeared, dropped from planes, announcing that Japan had surrendered, they were immediately dismissed as lies. Why wouldn't they be? From the soldiers' perspective, this was exactly what the enemy would do. Fake surrender notices, fake newspapers, fake broadcasts. The war wasn't over, it had simply changed shape. And so they stayed hidden. Years passed, supplies dwindled, rifles were cleaned again and again, ammunition was rationed like gold. The men adapted, hunting and stealing food from nearby villages under cover of darkness. When they encountered civilians, they didn't see farmers. They saw potential collaborators. Each encounter reinforced their belief. The enemy was still active. What makes this moment so disturbing isn't ignorance, it's commitment. By the time the outside world assumed everyone from that unit was dead, the soldiers on the island had already crossed a psychological line. They had sacrificed too much to accept that it had all been for nothing. And that's the trap. Admitting the war was over didn't just mean lowering their weapons. It meant accepting that decades of hardship, fear, and violence had been unnecessary, that friends had died for no reason, that loyalty had outlived its purpose. For a soldier trained never to question orders, that realization was more terrifying than the jungle itself. By the early 1950s, reports began circulating of mysterious attacks on the island, crops destroyed, shots fired, traps discovered deep in the forest. At first, officials assumed it was criminal activity, smugglers, bandits, or misunderstandings. But the truth was far stranger. Someone was still fighting a war no one else believed in anymore. And as the years passed, one chilling question remained unanswered. How long can a war survive when only a handful of men still believe in it? In the next chapter, we'll uncover the single order that locked these soldiers into history, and why, once it was given, walking away became almost impossible. To understand why the war never ended on that island, you have to understand the order that sealed their fate and the mindset that made it unbreakable. In the final months of World War II, as Japan's position in the Pacific collapsed, commanders issued desperate instructions to units stranded far from the mainland. Retreat was impossible. Resupply was unlikely. Survival itself was uncertain. But surrender, that was not an option. On this island, the commanding officer gathered his men and gave them what would become their final directive. It was brief, deliberate, and absolute. Continue resistance. Do not surrender. Wait for further orders. There was no timeline, no contingency plan, no scenario outlined for defeat. The assumption was simple. The empire would endure, and eventually communication would be restored. For soldiers raised in the Japanese Imperial Army, this wasn't just an instruction. It was identity. From the moment they enlisted, these men were taught that obedience was the highest form of honor. The emperor was not merely a leader, he was sacred. Orders were not suggestions to be interpreted. They were commands to be carried out until death. Surrender was not survival, it was disgrace. This belief system wasn't abstract, it was drilled into them daily. Soldiers memorized codes of conduct that placed duty above life itself. Stories of warriors choosing death over capture weren't cautionary tales. They were examples to be followed. So when the world outside the island shifted, these men did not shift with it. When leaflets began falling from the sky declaring that Japan had surrendered in 1945, the soldiers examined them carefully and rejected them completely. From their perspective, no official command had arrived through the proper military chain. No trusted officer had delivered the order in person. And until that happened, nothing else mattered. Anything less was assumed to be enemy deception. This wasn't paranoia, it was procedure. The Allied forces had used psychological warfare throughout the Pacific. Fake broadcasts, manipulated documents, and misinformation campaigns were common. The soldiers on the island knew this. In fact, they had been trained to expect it, which meant that the more convincing the messages became, the more suspicious they seemed. Years passed, and the jungle became their barracks. They divided duties, maintained patrol schedules, conducted reconnaissance. Every action followed the logic of a war still in progress. Even disagreements among them were resolved through military hierarchy, not debate. And then came the radio. At one point, the soldiers managed to intercept broadcasts that sounded undeniably real. News reports, music, casual conversations. A Japan that no longer spoke the language of war. But instead of offering clarity, it deepened the confusion. How could the enemy replicate normalcy so convincingly? The conclusion they reached was chilling. The enemy had perfected its deception. By this point, surrender wasn't just forbidden. It was unimaginable. Too much time had passed. Too much blood had been spilled. Too many risks had been taken, based on the belief that the war was ongoing. If the war was over, then everything they had done since 1945 would become something else entirely. Not duty, not service, mistakes. And for men trained to see failure as dishonor, that realization was unbearable. So they clung tighter to the original order, the one given by a superior they trusted, the one that still made sense of their reality. As long as that order stood, their world remained intact. But outside the jungle, the world had already moved on. And in the next chapter, we'll see what happened when undeniable proof of peace finally reached the island, and why even that wasn't enough to end the war. By the time the first real proof of peace reached the island, the soldiers had already been fighting a war that no longer existed for nearly a decade. From the outside, it seemed impossible that anyone could still believe World War II was ongoing. Japan had rebuilt its cities. The emperor had spoken publicly. Treaties had been signed. The world had moved forward. But none of that mattered in the jungle, because belief doesn't change with facts. It changes with trust. And trust was the one thing these soldiers no longer had. Allied forces and Japanese officials made repeated attempts to reach them. Aircraft dropped leaflets written in careful, respectful language, explaining that Japan had surrendered and urging them to lay down their arms. Some messages included photographs of family members, handwritten notes, even official seals meant to prove authenticity. The soldiers read every word and dismissed every single one. To them, the leaflets weren't proof of peace. They were evidence of psychological warfare. The language was too polished, the timing too convenient, the message too perfectly tailored to break their resolve. From their perspective, this was exactly how an enemy would try to flush out holdouts. When newspapers were dropped, they were studied for inconsistencies. Dates were cross-checked, stories compared. Any small discrepancy, a missing detail, a tone that felt unfamiliar, was enough to discredit the entire message. The soldiers concluded that the enemy had access to Japanese printing presses or had captured journalists. Nothing could be trusted unless it came through military command. Even when loudspeakers were used to broadcast messages from Japanese officials, the reaction was the same. Voices could be imitated, speeches could be faked, and if the enemy wanted them alive, it was only to interrogate or execute them. Then came the most disturbing attempt of all. Voices from home. Family members were flown to the island. Recordings were played. Messages were broadcast into the jungle, calling soldiers by name, pleading with them to come out. To outsiders, this should have ended everything. No one would doubt their own mother's voice. But the soldiers did. By this point, years of isolation had hardened their worldview. Any emotional appeal was seen as a weapon. If the enemy knew their names, their hometowns, their families, that only confirmed how deep the deception ran. Accepting these messages as real would require an impossible leap, trusting the enemy over their last official order. And that order still stood. As time passed, the group grew smaller. Some soldiers died from illness. Others were killed in skirmishes with local police or villagers. A few disappeared into the jungle, choosing isolation over doubt. Each loss reinforced the mindset of those who remained. Survival became proof. Resistance became identity. The jungle itself became part of the illusion. The world beyond it felt artificial, distant, staged. The only reality that made sense was the one defined by patrol routes, hidden camps, and stolen supplies. And there was another problem. No one on the outside fully understood. Even if they accepted that the war was over, what came next? Surrender meant facing a world that had aged without them. It meant standing before people who had lived entire lives while they had stood still. It meant explaining decades of violence committed in the name of a war that no longer existed. For these men, disbelief wasn't ignorance, it was protection. So they stayed hidden, armed, watching, waiting. And as the years stretched into decades, one truth became harder to ignore. They weren't just fighting the enemy anymore. They were fighting the idea that everything they believed in was already gone. In the next chapter, we'll step inside their daily lives and see what it actually meant to survive inside a war frozen in time. By the 1960s, the island had become something more than a hiding place. It was a closed world, governed by rules that belonged to another era, sustained by men who no longer measured time in years, but in patrols, ambushes, and survival. For the soldiers still holding out, daily life followed the rhythm of a war that no one else could see. They woke before dawn, not because of alarms, but because visibility mattered. Morning light revealed movement, tracks, signs that someone, civilian or enemy, had passed nearby. Camps were dismantled regularly and rebuilt deeper in the jungle to avoid detection. Nothing stayed permanent for long. Permanence invited discovery. Food was never secure. They hunted when they could, trapping small animals and fishing in streams. When that failed, they raided nearby farms at night, stealing rice, tools, and supplies. These raids were not acts of desperation in their minds. They were military operations, carefully planned, swift, silent. To the island's civilians, however, they were terrifying. Villagers reported shots fired from the forest, fields destroyed, animals slaughtered. Sometimes people were injured, sometimes worse. Local authorities struggled to respond, unsure whether they were dealing with criminals, ghosts, or something in between. What no one could fully grasp was how real the war still felt to the men in the jungle. They maintained their weapons meticulously, even as parts wore down beyond repair. Rifles were cleaned daily, ammunition was counted, hidden, and reused when possible. Uniforms were patched and repurposed, symbols of a role they refused to abandon. And then there was the mental toll. Living in constant readiness changes the way a person thinks. Every sound becomes a threat. Every unfamiliar shape becomes an enemy. Over time, caution turns into suspicion, and suspicion into certainty. The soldiers stopped seeing the outside world as something that had moved on. They saw it as something pretending to be peaceful. The jungle reinforced this belief. Radios crackled with fragments of broadcasts that made no sense in a wartime framework. Music played where marching orders should have been. Advertisements replaced speeches. To the soldiers, this wasn't proof of peace. It was proof of manipulation. The enemy, they believed, had grown sophisticated. As years passed, the group thinned. Some soldiers died quietly, buried in unmarked jungle graves. Others vanished after patrols, never returning. Each death tightened the resolve of those who remained. Quitting now would mean admitting that their fallen comrades had died for nothing, and that was unthinkable. What's most unsettling is how normal this life became to them. Fear faded into routine. Isolation turned into familiarity. The idea of returning to society, of speaking to civilians, of being seen, began to feel more frightening than the jungle itself. By now, the war wasn't something they were waiting to end. It was something they were maintaining. But outside the island, patience was wearing thin. Attacks continued. People were getting hurt. And somewhere beyond the trees, officials realized that leaflets and broadcasts would never be enough. If the war was ever going to end, it would require something far more dangerous than proof. It would require confronting belief itself. In the next chapter, we'll reach the moment when the outside world finally tried something different, and why even then, surrender was not guaranteed. By the early 1970s, it was clear that the war on the island would not end on its own. Decades of leaflets, broadcasts, and pleas had failed. Every attempt to convince the remaining soldiers that World War II was over had only reinforced their belief that the enemy was persistent, clever, and deeply invested in deception. Proof, no matter how overwhelming, meant nothing without trust. So officials made a radical decision. Instead of trying to persuade the soldiers with evidence, they would confront them with authority. One man still held the power to end the war. Not a general, not a politician, but the officer who had given the original order decades earlier. If he was alive, and if he could be found, his words would carry the weight no leaflet ever could. A search began. After years of effort, Japanese authorities tracked down the former commanding officer, now an elderly civilian living quietly, far removed from the jungle and the war he had left behind. When he was told that his men were still fighting, still following his last command, the news stunned him, but he agreed to go. In 1974, he traveled to the island wearing a formal uniform, not out of ceremony, but necessity. Appearance mattered, rank mattered, the ritual mattered. Anything less would be dismissed. When he entered the jungle and called out to the soldiers, it wasn't with emotion, it was with command. He formally relieved them of duty. He officially rescinded the order to continue fighting. For the men who emerged from the trees, the moment was not triumphant. It was devastating. Some wept, others stood frozen, unable to process what they were hearing. The war hadn't ended because the world had changed. It ended because the one rule they had built their reality around had finally been rewritten. But even then, surrender was not immediate. Years of distrust do not dissolve in a single moment. Weapons were lowered slowly. Movements were cautious. The soldiers watched for traps that never came. Their bodies were free, but their minds were still inside the war. What they faced next was almost worse than combat. The realization that everything had ended decades earlier came crashing down all at once. The silence they had interpreted as strategy was peace. The broadcasts they dismissed as propaganda were truth. The enemy they had feared no longer existed. And now they had to live with that. For some, the shame was overwhelming. They had fought. They had killed. They had survived, all in a world that had already moved on without them. The thought of returning to Japan, of facing society, of explaining where they had been for 30 years, felt unbearable. But the war was over. Officially. Finally. In the next chapter, we'll follow what happened after surrender, and why the end of the war did not mean the end of its consequences. When the last soldier stepped out of the jungle, the world didn't know how to react. For the island's residents, it was relief mixed with disbelief. For the governments involved, it was a logistical and moral challenge. And for the men who had fought a war long after it had officially ended, it was the beginning of something far more difficult than survival. Re-entry into the world was not a celebration. It was a shock. The soldiers were weak, malnourished, and cautious. Decades of isolation had rewired their instincts. Loud noises triggered alertness. Crowds felt dangerous. The idea of standing in open spaces without cover felt wrong. War had been their structure, their purpose, their identity, and now it was gone. When news of their surrender broke internationally, headlines spread quickly. Some people viewed them as tragic figures, symbols of loyalty taken too far. Others saw them as dangerous relics of a violent past. In Japan, the reaction was complex. There was sympathy, but also discomfort. These men were living reminders of a war the nation had spent decades trying to move beyond. For the soldiers themselves, time had collapsed. They returned to a country that no longer recognized the world they had left. Technology had advanced. Cities had changed. Families had aged or disappeared entirely. Friends were gone. Parents were dead. Entire chapters of life had passed without them. And then there was the weight of memory. They had lived under constant tension for decades, believing every day could be their last. That kind of fear doesn't fade easily. Some struggled to sleep, others struggled to speak. The habits of survival, suspicion, isolation, readiness lingered long after the weapons were gone. But perhaps the most painful realization came slowly. They hadn't just lost years, they had lost the chance to choose differently. Had they known the truth earlier, would they have surrendered? Or was belief so tightly bound to identity that surrender had never really been possible? These questions followed them quietly, without answers. Their story forced the world to confront something uncomfortable. War doesn't end when treaties are signed. It ends when belief changes. And sometimes, belief is the hardest battlefield of all. On that island, World War II ended nearly 35 years late. Not because the soldiers didn't hear the news, but because they couldn't accept it without breaking everything they were. So, ask yourself this. If your entire identity was built on loyalty, duty, and sacrifice, how would you know when it was finally time to stop fighting? If this story made you rethink what war really does to people, leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe for more true stories, history almost erased.